What's happening? I'm Mike Willett with Red Lion. This session is going to focus on some additional parameters you might need to consider during the initial setup of an NT5000 switch. Alright, let's get started. First of all, if you need to access this switch management remotely, you will need to add a default gateway in order to route to the switch management interface. The default gateway can be added under the System tab and then under the IP Interfaces tab. If you are not familiar, the gateway is the device that will be routing the switch management through the network and represent our next hop. This could be a router, a firewall, a layer 3 switch, or something like that. In this case, my next hop is going to be the device at the IP address of 192.168.1.40. And then I'll go ahead and save those changes. As you can see, my gateway is on the same subnet as my switch interface IP address. So now we've configured a default gateway. Something else to consider might be syslog. This won't always be a requirement to export logs to a remote server, but in the event that this is a requirement, it is very simple to set up. You configure this under alarms and then syslog. Here is the log that it stores on the switch itself, but to send this log to an external server, you would navigate to config, and then you can point to up to 5 servers if you want to, and you can set the minimum severity level of the logs being sent. Now, just briefly, I wanted to point out where you would add a new VLAN if you needed to under the Ports and VLANs tab, and then under VLANs, and then here you would select the Add button. Now, I don't want to go in depth about VLANs in this session, but if you want to learn more about VLANs in the NT5000 switch, I would direct you to the NT5000 VLANs video. Okay, another thing, often during the initial setup of a switch, you might need to comply with some type of redundancy setting within your network. Under the Redundancy tab, and then under Bridge Config, you will see that spanning tree is on by default. The default is MSDP, which is multiple spanning tree. But for example, if you have a requirement to use rapid spanning tree or RSTP in your network, you can select RSTP here. RSTP is very common, but considering that spanning tree is an enterprise protocol, it can take a few seconds to recover. So if you have a requirement to configure an industrial redundancy protocol with a much faster recovery time, you can configure NRing here. NRing will resolve in the milliseconds and be way more efficient with industrial devices on the network such as PLCs, drives, and things like that. The default setting is auto member, but if you wanted to configure this switch to be the ring manager, you would navigate to config and change the ring mode to manager. Now we have the option to use the 2 copper ports for the ring or the 2 SFP ports, which would typically be populated with fiber, which I will leave it at that setting. And then I will save my changes. One last thing to touch on briefly is the user privilege levels. So under the Security tab, and then Privileges, you can see that the range shown here is 0 to 15. But a privilege level of 5 grants read access only. A privilege level of 10 grants read-write access. Now, access to maintenance such as software uploads or resetting the switch to factory defaults, that requires a privilege level of 15. So just to give you an example here, if I wanted to restrict the Alarms tab on the configuration side of things to read only, if I change rewrite to something that's 5 or below, now for the alarm settings, I no longer have access to read-write. I have access to read-only on the configuration side. And I will save those settings. This was just an example of privilege levels. If I leave this at defaults, I then have a user with full access. One last thing to do at the end, anytime you're making changes to the switch and you want to save them to memory, you'll see that I have this populated here. I click on this. I save my current configuration. Alright, that concludes an overview of some more advanced settings you might make changes to during the initial setup of an NT5000 switch. I hope you found this video useful. Thank you. See you next time.